Okay.
Okay. All right, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
How are you? Welcome to the Bill Roll lecture. Thank you for coming. Just an announcement to those of you on Zoom. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Send me a sign. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. Okay, good. So just a reminder to please mute yourself if you're on Zoom.
Otherwise, no.
Please mute yourself.
And cell phones on silent, please.
Yes, and then cell phones on silent, please. Thank you. Right. All right. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the fall 2023 Bill Roll lecture. We are excited to be featuring Professor Chris Rowe this year from the University of Northampton in the United Kingdom. Dr. Christine Simmons-Moore will have the honor of properly introducing him a bit later on this evening. My name is Dr. Jacob Glazier, and I am an assistant professor of psychology at the University of West Georgia. First, I would like to provide you with some context for this really important event that honors parapsychological research in general, but also I want to stress in higher education. It's a very unique aspect to psychology here at UWG. Like so many of us, Dr. Roll's interest in the paranormal arose out of his own personal experience, specifically of being out of body when he was just 16 years old. Back then, at least, it was probably more acceptable to devote a career out of parapsychology. And Dr. Roll did just that. He went on to work as part of J.B. Rhine's famous Duke Parapsychological Laboratory in Durham, North Carolina, where you can find the Rhine Research Center located today. He became the director of the Psychical Research Foundation and served as a professor at the University of West Georgia in the 1980s with funding from the PRF. Dr. Roll, perhaps, is best known for his work on poltergeists or noisy ghost cases. These include the famous Seaford poltergeist case and the Columbus poltergeist case. He served as president of the Parapsychological Association. He wrote 4 books, published over 100 scholarly articles, and edited 11 volumes of research in parapsychology. Ooh, that's a list. We have a long tradition here at West Georgia of supporting parapsychological research. The Bill Roll Lecture is now in its 11th year, if you can believe that, and it was started in 2012 by Dr. Simmons-Moore. The Exceptional Experiences Research Lab, or EERL, has a multi-institutional and interdisciplinary membership of faculty and students working on pertinent projects. Some of these include ASMR and psychometry, ESP and float tanks, geographic anomalies and exceptional experiences, aphantasia, and local paranormal folklore, among others. But we couldn't do all of this without your help. If you're interested in supporting parapsychological research, the EERL, the lab, and the Bill Roll Lecture here at the University of West Georgia, you can find out more about how to contribute by visiting the UWG Bill Roll Lecture page, or scanning the program, the QR code, to pull that up too. So we greatly appreciate any contributions you can offer. Adjacent to the education and scholarship in parapsychology offered in the psychology program, the Ingram Library's special collections here on campus houses the Bill Roll archives and many others. which include manuscripts on ESP, its links to poltergeists, near-death experiences, and other psi phenomena. Our next speaker is the interim head of Ingram Library Special Collections, Blynn Olivieri Parker. She, along with her team at Special Collections, has made West Georgia here just internationally known repository for literature on consciousness, exceptional experiences, and parapsychology. Blynn, thank you for your continued support of the Bill Roll Lecture. Please join me in welcoming Blynn to the podium.
Thank you, Jake, for that lovely introduction and preamble, which is a great overview of Bill Roll's contributions to psychology and parapsychology. It is my pleasure to be here with you tonight to give a brief overview of the Bill Roll papers, which are housed in Ingram Library. And so, as Dr. Glazier said, my name is Blynn Olivieri Parker, and my title is actually interim head of learning and research services for Ingram Library, which encompasses responsibilities for the collections and operations of special collections, all under this large bailiwick. But it's great because it is part and parcel of certainly learning, research, and promoting scholarship across campus, and using our research collections to promote scholarship internationally. Special Collections in Ingram Library holds the rare, unique, valuable resources like rare books, rare serial publications, rare maps, and archival collections. Topically, the collections cover Georgia politics, regional history, people and culture, so this West Georgiana, as I call it, the university archives, and then distinguishably, our humanistic psychology and human consciousness collections. The humanistic psychology and human consciousness collections were founded to support the unique psychology academic program here at UWG. The complementary primary resource collections in Ingram Library are deep, distinctive, and the best in North America. A signature archive in this humanistic psychology and humanistic consciousness studies is the Bill Roll papers. Measuring out to 224 boxes, the Roll papers are rich with poltergeist and haunting case files, files of experiments, reports, topical files, correspondence, and manuscripts for his articles and books. The papers demonstrate the power of his intellect, the spectrum of his connections, and from a bird's eye view provide insight into the American and global attention to psychic phenomenon from the late 1950s through the 2000s, and certainly it continues today. Bill Roll was not only a researcher, author, and professor in the field of parapsychology, plumbing the possibilities of human consciousness and our relationship to ourselves, others, objects, the world around us, and the cosmos, but he also collected materials. So his well-organized papers and library of print materials, particularly the rare international serials that he collected, are invaluable sources for documenting psychology and human culture. His papers and his print library have been used by students, scholars, members of the public, and as you may have seen, have appeared in numerous television shows, in documentaries, and in books. Most recently in the 3-part docuseries on Hulu released in August, Demons and Saviors, which is based in part upon the Bill Roll papers here at UWG. The importance of academic institutions like the University of West Georgia in collecting, preserving, and providing access to these rare and one-of-a-kind materials is not only that it provides a robust and extensive research source for academicians, but that it demonstrates human experiences, the range of human experiences. Worldwide, people have life-altering events and experience phenomenon like near-death experiences, communications from deceased loved ones, and premonitions. Can you imagine if this very real experience wasn't documented? And that is the importance of libraries and archives to preserve these research materials for you, for anyone, and for the future. So cheers to Bill Roll for his conscious effort to share his research materials with you, and for this lecture series, and to Dr. Christine Simmons-Moore for starting this and having the vision to do that, and for you for engaging in the search for meaning. I'd love to speak with any of you about special collections, to set up an exploratory, you're just curious about something, or based upon a research project you're working on, and we can set up an appointment for you, or just even a discussion, and to explore the vast resources that we have for you. So please feel welcome to contact our special collections team at special@westgaw.edu. Thank you all.
All right. Good evening, everyone. It's my turn to take the podium. I just want to thank everybody again for joining us this evening for the annual Bill Roll lecture. It's my honor and privilege to introduce the 2023 Bill Roll lecturer, Professor Chris Rowe. I first met Chris when I interviewed for a PhD studentship on the psychology of anomalous experience at the University of Northampton a long time ago now. I was extremely fortunate to be awarded the studentship and be able to read my PhD with Chris as my supervisor. I was actually Chris's first doctoral student and worked closely with him throughout the time I was doing my PhD and successfully defended my thesis. Since that time, Chris has successfully supervised many other doctoral students who are currently very active within the field of parapsychology internationally. He is a highly respected scholar who has successfully maintained a strong research agenda and inspired others to do the same. Chris earned his PhD from the Koestler Chair of Parapsychology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in the UK. His own doctoral work explored the ways in which you don't want to think of you love me. Where are we? Yeah, his doctoral work explored the ways in which psychic effects might be simulated using more conventional psychological techniques, known collectively as cold reading. He left Edinburgh to teach research methods in the psychology department at St Andrews University, which is also in Scotland, and then he moved south to the University of Northampton, where he still is. He started there in 1995 as a lecturer in psychology. At the University of Northampton, Chris teaches a wide range of academic courses on psychology, parapsychology, and transpersonal psychology, and currently holds the position of chair in psychology, which is basically a very big deal in the UK, translating to the American audience. He runs a research group called the Exception Experience and Consciousness Studies Group, EECS, which includes other scholars with interest in exceptional experiences, including parapsychology. Chris is an internationally recognized scholar. His research interests are wide-ranging. He's interested in understanding the nature of anomalous experiences and has conducted research on the phenomenology of paranormal experiences, particularly as it affects psychological well-being. He's also explored the psychology of paranormal belief and of deception and how that works in terms of paranormal phenomena. His work also applies experimental methods to test the claims for extrasensory perception and psychokinesis, particularly where they involve psychological factors. His recent research has been concerned with the relationship between altered states of consciousness and psychic experiences. He's extremely prolific and has published over 120 journal papers and book chapters and given over 200 conference presentations. Chris has held a number of positions within academic parapsychology. He is the international affiliate for England of the Parapsychology Foundation and is a vice president of the Society for Psychical Research. Chris served as a senior researcher for the Parapsychological Fund at Trinity College in Cambridge. He has been the chair of the British Psychological Society Transpersonal Psychology section. He has been the president of the Parapsychological Association and the president of the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research. He is currently associate editor for the Journal of Parapsychology and is on the editorial board for the Journal of Society for Psychical Research and the Transpersonal Psychology Review. I count Chris as my academic father, mentor, colleague, and friend. I look forward to collaborating with him as we move forward on an upcoming international multi-site Gansfeld replication, which is focusing on precognition. Very excited to hear him speak this evening. And without further ado, I'd like to formally introduce his presentation this evening, which is titled Parapsychology as a Science of Lived Experience, the Value of Real-World Cases. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Chris Rowe.
Can you hear me okay? And can you see the screen?
We can.
Fabulous. Wow, after that warm and generous introduction, I don't know whether I should just say thank you and good night. Thank you everybody for coming along this afternoon, evening, or very late at night here in the UK to listen to this talk. I'd certainly like to thank Jake and Christine for inviting me to talk to you tonight. It's a great privilege for me to be asked to give the lecture in honor of Bill Rowe. I didn't know Bill very well, but did have the pleasure of meeting him on a few occasions at conferences, and can particularly recall having lunch with him in Paris as he regaled a group of us with details from some of the cases that he had investigated. The kinds of phenomena that he witnessed at first hand are a source of envy for many of the rest of us who spend our time in the laboratory dealing with much more meager effects, or work vicariously by collecting the testimonies of others about their paranormal experiences. Bill's journey, however, began in the laboratory, as Jake explained earlier on, first at Oxford in the UK and then at Duke, North Carolina with J.B. Rhine, before his attention shifted to the real world and the challenge of mapping phenomena in situ in their natural environment as they naturally occur, emphasis intended. In some ways, my own career has followed a similar path, as I'll try and explain in the first few slides in a moment. So this is where I need to switch because it doesn't automatically switch there. If I do that, hopefully your slide is now changed. Okay. To begin with, I should tell you something about my own training and experience so you have a sense of how that might have shaped my expectations about what a scientific parapsychology should look like. I think this photo is from about 2001, though it looks like it should be even earlier, clearly before the era of digital cameras, so please forgive the fuzziness of the image. This was taken not long after completing my own PhD, as Christine explained. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Also in the picture, you can see Simon Sherwood and David Luke, who were still active in parapsychology, who were colleagues of mine at Northampton, as well as Bob Morris, who was my PhD supervisor at the University of Edinburgh. Now, my undergraduate degree from Edinburgh was actually in biological sciences, specializing in psychology. In the first year, I studied physics, chemistry, and biology, so not even any psychology, let alone parapsychology. And at this point, I was a philosophically naive positivist researcher. My education within the natural sciences taught me that the scientific method was simply a process of disciplined observation, and those observations guarded against the ways in which we might deceive ourselves when making observations and when drawing inferences from those observations. So that's at the heart of the scientific method, is to notice our fallibilities and to introduce checks and balances to compensate for them. From that perspective, nature might seem inscrutable, but would give up its secrets with appropriate efforts and diligence on my part. Science was simply a process of increasing refinement and exactitude, particularly in measurements, and all meaningful properties of the world could be measured objectively and consistently if we were careful enough. I was soon to discover the limits of this philosophy when I came to conduct my own original research. So this has been hinted at in the introduction. My PhD studies as part of the Kersler Parapsychology unit involved experimental work that focuses on a technique called cold reading. Cold reading is intended to simulate psychic effects and is used by psychics as a catch-all explanation for any real-world psychic demonstration. I wanted to interrogate it in more detail to see whether it was indeed capable of accounting for even the most impressive evidence that might come from psychics and mediums in the real world. I developed an account of cold reading that was based on materials usually only shared among members of the magic profession in how-to manuals. I also worked with a pseudopsychic that we can see here on the slide, whom we called Malcolm Davidson, which is a pseudonym. He was still active at the time. He'd built a career using cold reading to produce psychic demonstrations, either during public events, but more often in private sittings. We videoed his interactions with some naive sitters and then recorded him reviewing the videos to explain what stratagems he was actually using in real time. I went on to design experiments that tested some of the predictions of cold reading, relating to what material could be recalled and in what form. And to my knowledge, this is still the only experimental research on cold reading. The results tended to support the claims that magicians were making, but that's not why I mention it here. It was in that experimental work that I made what was for me a profound discovery. Some of my participants were conducting their own experiments in my experiments. There are some statements that are called Barnum statements, so this is to explain. They're called Barnum statements, and these are particularly useful to the pseudopsychic because people rate them as really accurate descriptions of themselves, but they don't really seem to realize that they would be equally true for other people. And I wanted to see experimentally if these same statements recommended by pseudopsychics would act in the same way as conventional Barnum statements. I used a non-psychic situation, evaluating a projective personality test called the house tree person test, as a ruse, so that I could get them to rate the accuracy and specificity of these pseudopsychic statements as personality descriptions. I met each participant individually and explained that the personality test involved them drawing a house, a tree, and a person, along with anything else they felt inspired to add. I would take their drawing away to an analyst trained to interpret their drawings, and that they would produce a personality description based on their interpretation. Of course, all the participants actually received the same character description. Because the experiment involved an element of deception, after I'd given them their feedback and they had evaluated it, I spent some time with them explaining the ruse and debriefing them about the experiment. It was then that some disclosed that when they'd been thinking about the house tree person test as I introduced it to them, and were wondering about what the analyst might make of their drawings, they started to develop some hunches of their own. Maybe if you drew a large person relative to the size of the house, that might suggest narcissism. If you draw a person with large eyes, maybe that might suggest paranoia, those kind of things. And so some of my participants included elements in their drawings as a kind of experiment of their own within my experiments to see if that might affect the feedback that they were given. Of course, it didn't, but they still were very confident that the readings they got confirmed their suspicions and that the things that they'd included had been interpreted in the ways that they expected. The more important message is this. It drove home to me the idea that 95% of the experiment actually takes place between the ears of the participant, not in the equipment or in the materials or in the experimenter's script. People are meaning-oriented. They make sense of the situations they find themselves in, including experimental situations, and it's within the context of their own prior experiences, their expectations, and their needs that sense-making co-creates the situation. Hence, if we're to design effective lab-based research, it needs to show some awareness of the complex process that's going on within the person. That got me thinking about what those contexts involve. How much do we actually know about the experiences that people have in the real world, and to what extent is it taken into account when we design our own experiments? This reflection is especially important, I think, in a subject like parapsychology, where the phenomena seem to be subtle or capricious. So even slight changes to the situation psychologically, as well as physically, can dramatically change the outcome. I think we can illustrate the perspective that I'm arguing for in this graphic. It represents a research cycle that grounds research questions and study designs in spontaneous real-world occurrences. So the real-world phenomena dictates the shape of the questions that we can ask and the methods by which we can interrogate those questions. And it also requires that when we gather experimental evidence, it must in some way feed directly back to those lived experiences. It must be able to have something important or meaningful to say to ordinary people about their paranormal experiences. This next slide is a bit of an indulgence, but I like to quote J.B. Ryan at this point. It's a bit of a stretch, but also so I can show you this picture. J.B. Ryan very famously said, if you want to have rabbit stew, then first you need to know how to catch a rabbit. I think we probably wouldn't talk about rabbit stew now. We might think about capturing a rabbit so we could keep it as a pet perhaps and nurture it. But the essence of the metaphor is that we have no hope of capturing psi in the laboratory if we don't have a deep understanding of how psi might operate in the real world, in its natural state among ordinary people. What needs does it serve there? Under what circumstances might it occur? For which particular people is it more common? Those are exactly the kind of issues that we need to resolve now before we think about trying to transplant those phenomena into the laboratory. A little bit later, I'm going to be talking about telephone telepathy as perhaps a really good example of that. So I want to share with you some examples of that approach in practice. And the first of these is a study we conducted using a database collected by Sir Alister Hardy and people who have continued the work of the Alister Hardy Research Experience Research Unit. So Alister Hardy is a UK academic. He was a marine biologist who was knighted for his services to science. Throughout his long and very eminent career, he always had an interest in spiritual matters, spiritual phenomena. And finally, as for many people, when he retired, he found that he had the time to indulge in that particular interest. And he established the research unit when he retired in 1969 at Manchester College, Oxford University. And mainly what he wanted to do was to map or to document people's spontaneous experiences of the immaterial things. So the spiritual, something other. So he famously created this phrase, something other or something greater than oneself, something that gave us pause or for reflection, a sense of connection with something greater than ourselves as a kind of an encapsulated biological organism. He typically would survey people asking a question of this or similar forms. Have you ever been aware of or been influenced by a presence or power, whether you call it God or not, which is different from your everyday self, something other or greater? Because he was quite eminent because of his biological work, it was easier for him to have a media profile and to reach out to the general public. And he was very eager to give television and radio interviews, to speak to people in magazines and newspaper interviews as well, and use us as a medium to invite people to write to him to describe their own experience. You know, where does their spiritual source come from? What experiences have they had that are particularly important to them, and give them a spiritual sense? Fortunately, although those letters were written over time from the 1960s onwards, they've actually been transcribed by members of the research unit, and there's a very large database that now has its home at the University of Wales, Trinity St David. And students of mine, Rebecca Linnett and I, were able to access that database to look for cases that might include that related to parapsychological phenomena. This was an untapped resource. To our knowledge, nobody had used this as a way to mine for a collection of spontaneous parapsychological or paranormal experiences. And although the emphasis might be on matters spiritual, we hoped that we might find some cases that would fit our brief as well. So we reviewed the 6,500 cases which have been transcribed and are part of the database, and found that over 1,000 of them met our inclusion criteria. So to give you a flavor, the kind of cases that weren't included, included, for example, letters that describe personal philosophies or metaphysics, letters that reflected on mainly Christian scripture, biographical accounts of hardships for which religious faith had been a real support, although there were no experiences related to that. Experiences of imminence or nature mysticism, subjective experiences of deep peace and serenity, visions of religious persons or beings, and also cases where psychic phenomena were alluded to, but frustratingly were not described in any detail. So notwithstanding those excluded cases, we were left with over 1,000 cases that did describe parapsychological phenomena that fall within the normal umbrella of parapsychological research. Importantly, what we did with those was we analyzed those in a systematic way. We used a technique called content analysis to identify the ways in which those different cases might cluster together, to see if there were any common features that might give us some kind of hint or insight into underlying mechanisms or necessary conditions. Here's just a flavor of the cases. If you're interested, please do get in touch after the talk, and I'd be very happy to tell you much more about some of the cases we included in these collections. But very interestingly, we found that many cases were not the kind of overt psychic experiences that we typically have tried to cultivate in the laboratory, in the kind of ESP card guessing. We just saw Bill being an experimenter on a card guessing Xenocard experiment earlier. But very commonly, the experiences might be more embodied experiences, first of all, that maybe grew or developed over time. So, for example, an example of that foreboding type is the following. My mother had premonitions of everyday affairs. I can't really read that, so I'll have a look at my case. Oh. Bear with me, because the people's faces are covering half of the slide. So I'll just read from my other screen. My mother had premonitions over everyday affairs, such as one day, for example, she went shopping and she took the 20-minute branch line train journey, got to her destination, but suddenly felt that she must quickly return home when her train went back from the terminus. So she remained on the train and travelled straight home again, did no shopping at all. Our house was situated near the railway station. As mother stepped from the train, she saw smoke pouring from the home. And by quick action on the part of the fire brigade, whom my mother called, the house was saved. So that's quite a common feature of some of the spontaneous cases, for example, that Louisa Ryan collected at the Ryan Research Centre. This sense that people don't necessarily have vivid, very directed experiences of whatever it is that they're attuning to, but that there is this sense of unease, a sense of agitation, a sense of urgency to act. And that maybe over time gets honed. In this case, that I need to go home, something's wrong at home. And it turns out to be true. We have other cases which are more of the telepathy type, where people have more phenomenal experiences. So my husband went one night to a trade council meeting. I was at that time ill with pernicious anemia. I came over very ill and called my husband's name out, wishing for him to come home. And about 15 minutes later, he came in. He asked, "Are you all right, dear? Have you called me?" And when I told him I had, he said, "Yes, I heard you and came as soon as I could. I have no explanation about this, but it's quite true." Also includes some instances of NDE and OBE type experiences as well. So for example, case 4364. I was 8.5 years old and nearly died in a particular dental hospital after having a general anesthetic for a tooth extraction. I'd recently recovered from measles and my mother didn't know that she ought to tell them. As things were, it was too soon after the measles and I collapsed. Suddenly I shot up to the ceiling as if I were a piece of cork in a bowl of water, and actually watched the doctors massage my heart. There was an amazing feeling of lightness both in my weight and in the scene below. The real me was up there near the ceiling. With equal suddenness, I walloped back into my body and opened my eyes to see the doctors' groups around me. Frustratingly, these cases tend to be quite brief. This is the whole description of the actual experience. And it was quite limiting in terms of trying to find common threads that might truly speak to an underlying mechanism. But certainly one of the take-home messages for us was this idea that for many people, their experiences were regarded as momentous, profound experiences in their lifetime. So they might recount in these letters to Alistair Hardy, an experience that happened to them maybe 20 or 30 years previously. And yet, as they're describing these letters, this is still a touchstone experience for their life in times of adversity, when things are difficult, when there seems no prospect of moving forwards, these are the kind of things that give them pause, remind them in some way of their spiritual nature that underpins their everyday experience, and that gives them the additional fortitude to carry on. That's the way people describe these experiences. Apparitional experiences were the most common, particularly relating to deceased relatives, so that sense that some aspect of the personality can survive bodily death. ESP experiences were second most common, and they ranged from these kinds of very nebulous experiences, foreboding type experiences, often involving crisis telepathy, so relating to some urgent need to act, somebody's in danger in some form, through to things quite trivial perhaps, but also potentially quite personally meaningful, clairvoyance of lost objects and things like that. Near-death experiences were quite common in this collection, but of course we can't generalize in terms of prevalence. About 9% of the letters that we reviewed involved that. But sharing individual accounts like this, and one of the key take-home messages for us is that we try where we can to include people's actual lived cases to general audiences, to give people license to share their own experiences as well. So it's because we know that we're no longer alone. There's very much a tendency for people to feel siloed, to be alone, to be slightly embarrassed about these kinds of experiences, very often because of the immediate reaction we can get from others that tends to treat these as a source of ridicule or potentially an indicator of pathology. And so people socially learn not to disclose these kinds of experiences. And I think simply the very act of collecting cases and sharing them with people can serve a real important purpose. At the same time, I think we may be missing particular types of phenomena when we're soliciting cases like this, because the selection method, having people volunteer letters, prioritizes the dramatic, the ones that people might think that the researcher would be interested in because they're sufficiently substantial. Give you a flavor of another instance. This is quite an ongoing situation now, that this is a project we finished and we now have a continuation project. It's rather dated in some respects. So back in 1988, the BBC recorded a documentary for one of the documentary companies, QED, and it was called Glimpses of Death. And it included personal accounts of near-death experiences, including Peter Fenwick as a psychiatrist who gave a dispassionate evaluation of the cases, looking at possible conventional explanations for why people might have an out-of-body experience, why they might have the sense of encountering deceased loved ones, and so on, but also being very open to the spiritual interpretation of these experiences too. When this documentary was aired, it actually solicited a reaction from the general public. So a number of people wrote letters in response to viewing the documentary that they submitted to the BBC, and many of them found their way either to the director of the documentary or to Peter Fenwick himself, and he very kindly shared those letters with us. So working with another student colleague, and again, one of the strategies we have at the University of Northampton is to try and provide opportunities for younger people trying to get a foothold in academia with small funded projects where we can hopefully see them through to a publication. And that sometimes is just enough to steel them to stay in the subject area long enough to maybe get a bursary or a studentship, or to find a part-time job that can support them while they take up master's level or PhD studies. So that's kind of hopefully Ashley's pathway. So we were given 358 letters that had been sent to the BBC in response to the Glimpses of Death documentary. We've reviewed all of those, and we found that about 40% of them, just under, did describe personal NDE and OBE experiences from members of the public. And again, these were experiences that had never been shared before in the public domain. Following that same pattern as before, rather than simply collecting together these cases, we wanted to use some kind of systematic approach. So again, we used the content analysis method in order to cluster together the cases that had superficial similarities to look to see whether that might tell us something meaningful about those cases. In particular, we were interested to revisit a suggestion by Ken Ring that an NDE might actually unfold in a particular sequence of stages, And that might be reflected in the relative incidence of different stages or steps, because people may be resuscitated at different stages of their near-death experience. So a sense of peace and well-being, essentially in the absence of the pain that they were immediately feeling prior to their NDE, that would be the most common experience in Ken Ring stages. That occurred to about 60% of his respondents had that sense of deep peace and well-being. Fewer, only 37%, had a sense of separation from the body, that sense now of looking down perhaps on the resuscitation attempt. Fewer still, only 25%, would have some kind of a tunnel or a darkness type experience. 16% saw a light or encountered a presence, and fewer still, 10%, would enter a beautiful garden, some heavenly place, and maybe again encounter other entities. So we were very interested within our collection from people who wouldn't have known about Ring's work or have any sense that that might be how their experience should unfold, to see whether they mapped onto that kind of process. And they certainly didn't. So you can see already that separation from body was much more common in our cases than were some of the other features. This again may be an artifact of the documentary itself, which did dramatize the out-of-body elements in a number of cases, and that might lead people who'd had that feature in their NDE to volunteer a letter to the BBC, whereas other people who didn't share that element would be less inclined to write a letter in response to it. That might be what's going on there. But because we could also code the circumstances under which people had their NDE, we were able to see whether there was any variation by type. So, for example, many people were in hospital, so they could benefit from resuscitation. Very often, a severe loss of blood or cardiac arrest were very typical triggers for their NDE. During or immediately after an operation, during or immediately after childbirth as well, they were quite common situations, and less common are the other categories, as you can see. Really very little came out of this from that perspective. I think the sample size is too small, except to show that the deep peace and well-being was particularly associated with circumstances in which people were previously in a great deal of pain. So if somebody had been in an accident, for example, and there wasn't pain associated with that, they were immediately unconscious, for example, after a road accident had been knocked over, they might have an autoscopic element, that separation from body, but they wouldn't notice that sublime sense because there wasn't really the same contrast with how they were feeling immediately before. Whereas people who were in hospital in the middle of a heart attack or experiencing some other excruciating pain, it's extremely noticeable for them that suddenly they're having this experience, at least of the absence of pain, and sometimes more so a sense of serenity and bliss associated with their experience. So here's a flavor of the kind of cases that we've curated from this collection. So night came, the light was put out, but I couldn't sleep because I was in a great deal of pain and feeling terribly ill. After some miserable hours, suddenly all the pain ceased and I felt happy and relaxed. I found I was floating on my back somewhere above the height of the ceiling, but there was no ceiling below me. And I looked down and saw a bed beneath me. On it lay a woman looking quite terrible. Her face was pallid and sweaty. Her hair was matted and streaked over the pillow. She was absolutely still and gave no sign of life. I said out loud, I think, poor thing, she's had it. It never occurred to me that I was looking at myself. And that again seems to be quite a common feature, that disinterested relationship with the body that's maybe being the subject of the resuscitation attempt. No sense of connection or desperation to want that body to survive or to be returned to it. The other case here, I went into hospital for a bladder checkup and my bladder was ruptured by the cystoscope and I was in violent pain. Then all the pain went. I had the sensation of floating above the bed on a massive cloud of cotton wool. It was a wonderful, peaceful feeling. And I'm sure that at that point that my soul left my body. I looked down the bottom of the ward and my mother was waiting. It may have lasted only a few seconds and I could see my body lying on the bed beneath me. I looked down at my wife and she seemed so forlorn, and I thought to myself, it's a shame to leave her now. And then all the pain returned, presumably as they returned to the body. And then an instance where somebody described seeing a light or encountering a presence. I felt an overwhelming feeling of peace and calm. I found myself in the most beautiful place. more beautiful and brightly coloured than anything I've ever seen in my life. I was crossing a bridge to my father, and I could see my mother and other relatives who had died. They were wearing white robes as shown in the programme. My father held his hand out to me as I crossed the bridge, and everyone was smiling up at me. Although I wanted to get over the bridge to reach my father, I felt as though a magnet were pulling me back. I returned to this dream more than once during the operation. I felt angry because I couldn't get to my father, and I wanted to continue feeling so peaceful. My father didn't speak to me, but kept smiling. It was the most wonderful experience I've ever had, and certainly changed my feelings about death. And again, very common in these letters is that sense of transformation as a result of the experiences that they've had, but also that sense of ambivalence because they'd learned not necessarily to share this experience with other people, or to be very wary about which people they did share it with. The third example is a little bit different from this. So again, with these cases that we have found it rather frustrating to work with these spontaneously volunteered accounts of experiences, because they are inevitably partial. There's no opportunity here for us to cross-examine or ask further questions, both in terms of getting people to elaborate on features. At times, I think members of the public presume too much of the reader, because Peter Fenwick is a very well-known researcher who's an expert on near-death experiences. They feel that he doesn't necessarily want to know about the nuts and bolts of their NDE experience, when in fact that's exactly what we do need for the record, the scientific record. We need to know about all the niceties of the experience, because that's where we might potentially learn the most. And so that's rather frustrating. And there's also a sense of omission. So some features are simply not mentioned at all, and that may not reflect the fact that they didn't occur, but rather the person's forgotten about them, or doesn't think that they're necessarily that important as features, and there's no opportunity to go back to these respondents and find out more. Certainly the way we work, these data are anonymized at the earliest opportunity, and there's no opportunity to go back to these people to find out more about their experiences. So I want to share with you a slightly different approach that we've undertaken to look at telephone telepathy. This may be a phenomenon that you've heard of before. Peter Fenwick has popularized this quite a lot in recent times, starting with survey work that seems to show that the experience of telephone telepathy is among the most common types of psychic experiences. And by this, we mean the experience that the telephone rings, and before we answer the phone, we immediately know who it is before we pick up the phone. And there seem to be lots of confirmations of that. Now, of course, there are many natural explanations that might account for that in conventional terms. So, for example, we have selective recall. We only remember times when the phone rang and we correctly guessed who might phone. Those times the phone rang and we guessed somebody else, we tend not to remember those as misses. Equally, we talk about times when we think of somebody and the phone doesn't ring. And maybe, there might have been a need for them to call, but they never did call. So there are lots of ways in which we overestimate the prevalence if we only have those direct hits, those confirmations to work with. It may also be the case that there are shared common features or common causes that we're not aware of. So one example I give is if you're listening to the radio and you hear a song that reminds you of your school days, and you're reminiscing about some times and remember somebody that you were very close to during your school days and you've completely lost touch with. And then a little bit later on, you get a Facebook friend request from that very person, or I don't know what the modern versions are, but my cultural references are a little bit out of date these days. But if you get a Facebook friend request and it's that very person you were just thinking about, you might be astonished. I was only just thinking about that person. That must be a psychic connection. When, of course, what may have happened is that they simply heard the same radio station that you did and went on a similar reminiscing journey. The only difference being that they acted on their reminiscences and looked you up and tried to reach out and make contact. Of course, experimentally, we can control for those normal explanations. We can, for example, randomly determine who is going to make a phone call. And we can make sure that there are boundaries in place, barriers, that prevent any normal way in which people might infer or communicate with the potential callers. There's a lovely example of this, again involving Rupert Sheldrake here, with a band, a musician band based in the UK called the Nolan Sisters. So this comprises 5 sisters who sing together and are a very close Irish origin band who have worked together very closely for many years. And in that experiment that features on YouTube, 4 of those sisters are sequestered in a nearby hotel with Sheldrake, while one of their sisters remains behind with the film crew. They're both being filmed simultaneously. Sheldrake very clearly rolls a die to determine which of the sisters should phone Colleen, the girl on the right here. Colleen hears the phone ring and has to say which sister it is before she picks up the phone. In this experiment, over admittedly a very short run, they had a 50% hit rate, when we should only expect 25% just by chance, because there are 4 sisters, and on each trial, because a die is determining who will call, there's an absolutely 25% chance of each of them calling. So that looks quite interesting. We've been a little bit concerned about the haste with which people like Sheldrake have rushed into the laboratory to test for telephone telepathy. And we wanted to find out a little bit more about how that might occur in the real world. So another colleague of mine, Leslie Ann Smith, featured here, and I conducted some focus group interviews with people. So we interviewed people in small groups of 2 or 3. We had a purposive sample method where we recruited people who had had vivid experiences of telephone telepathy that they were willing to share, that they were able to describe their experiences and then speculate about them. What do they mean to them? You know, are there some special circumstances under which they occur? What might we draw from that? Interestingly, we were only able to recruit female respondents to take part in the interviews, the focus groups, and the narratives were recorded and transcribed and analysed using thematic analysis as a technique. What did we find from this? Well, firstly, what seemed to be really interesting was spontaneously, many of the respondents noted that there seemed to be a conducive mental state that seemed to be necessary for telephone telepathy to work. So TR, for example, says, it's not a constant knowing, it's more a mind frame for me, being in the right frame of mind. Whether it's an altered state or an out of state or whatever, for me, it's all about whether you're open here, and points to her head. And if you've got your logic brain going on too much of the time, I don't get anything with that. But if I'm doing something inane, like washing up or standing around in the sitting room, and the kids have gone to bed, and suddenly my mind's nice and empty, yeah, that's when I get it. For RP, it's slightly different. For me, it's when I'm stressed and my mind's going 10 to the dozen of all the things I would be doing then. Yeah, my mind's on track somewhere else. It's kind of out of the way. It's not there at all. And I wasn't picking up something because I'm totally in a mental state and gone somewhere else. CB, I would say that when I'm busy, I get more. And when I'm running around doing lots and lots of work, lots going on in my life, and I think I said before, I might have to rely on this extra sense or something, that's when these messages come through to me and stuff happens. Or it could just be stress. I don't know. So that's kind of interesting as a reinforcement for what we seem to find from other strands of research, that there seems to be a conducive state of consciousness, one in which the ego self is kind of shifted from the forefront. If there are things we can do to facilitate that, that seems to be to give rise to better outcomes in our experimental work as well. Interestingly, they also had a kind of a reciprocal relationship with the emotional connection, both in stating that telephone telepathy would only occur if there was an established emotional connection with the person that they were in contact with through telephone telepathy. But equally, the occurrence of telephone telepathy was seen as a validation of that emotional connection. That was an expression of that connection for them. So again, here CB says, I tend to say, though, if I'm getting phone calls, it'll be from someone close. So like I said, my mum and this particular friend, Anthony, and a few girlfriends who I'm in tune with, should I say, and I'll randomly think about them and then suddenly get a call from them. And RP, I've got 2 sisters, and that's who I experience it with the most. And there must be a link to being emotionally close to someone and that ability. TR, I know a wide group of people, but it tends to be the ones that I really like, that I'm really connected to at the time, like my friend with her son, and I really like her, and I feel that we do bond. So there's always a closeness of a friendship that I have that's the strongest kind of knowing. So obviously, again, very clear suggestions for how we might want to engage in our research. One of the great things, though, about a more qualitative approach is that it allows much more easily for surprises. So it allows people to focus on or bring up features that maybe didn't occur to the researchers or are not part of the model that we're working with academically. So in our case, although we were particularly interested in when people received phone calls and whether they intuitively knew who it was who might be calling, our respondents also wanted to talk about times when they felt compelled to phone somebody else. And it kind of has a parallel with that sense of that ineffability, that foreboding that we've already seen in some of the other collections of cases. So TR, for example, says, I hadn't spoken to my brother for 6 years due to his wife and myself not getting on. But then I just had this overwhelming feeling one day and got up and phoned. And we lived in South Africa. And his servant said something was horribly wrong and we needed to sort things as he'd been in a horrific accident. But why did that give me that overwhelming feeling just at that time and that need to phone then? RP says, I only get that with my sisters and it's not a desire to be with them, but I need to check. I have a desire to check in with them. And without a doubt, every time something's happened. JR, I'll get an anxious feeling and not a general day-to-day every now and again. It'll be generally like when there was something wrong with my brother and I'm drawn to go and phone. That source, it's like a prickly feeling. And then RP similarly has this embodied feeling, first of all, that slowly over time starts to manifest in a particular direction, and then they feel compelled to act. So it gives me a little sick feeling sometimes. It's like travel sickness is the only way to describe it. And, it's not related to anything else. It may be my brother or it may be with Becca. And also this acted as a kind of a gateway to talk more generally about their sense of who they were as persons. And very much many of the respondents in our telephone telepathy focus groups regarded telephone telepathy as the ultimate triviality. In and of itself, it really wasn't important. It wasn't a phenomenon that gave them the pause in the way that we've seen from, for example, the Alistair Hardy collection, but it was indicative of something other. Some general sense of our deep interconnection with other living beings, our sense of having an inherent spiritual nature, but also having this sense of perhaps having some kind of divine or cosmic plan, which is intended to unfold in a particular way, and to serve particular life purposes. These were the kind of things that cropped up quite often with our participants, triggered by an initial conversation about telephone telepathy. So for JR, for example, it's not just telephone telepathy. And for me, it goes a lot further back. And trying to figure out that my first real, I suppose, wake-up call was that something that wasn't, I don't know, something was different. I had a horrific car accident with my brother, but I saw it in my dreams the night before. And everything was exactly as it was in the actual accident. And I thought, well, how did I do that? How bizarre was that? The car accident, it was absolutely a vivid dream. I seldom dream, or at least recall them, and that I remember. And CB, I've had experiences where they're negative, but I don't really see them as negative, and I see them as warning signals. I need to be aware of, so I'll get a warning of some sort, usually in a dream. So I have a dream about something, and then I think I've got to take notice of that. And I had 3 leading up to a car crash that I had. And I think in a way they were preparing me for that car crash. Something was kind of looking out for me, shall we say. So although these seem to be premonitory dreams, they're not necessarily intended to enable the person to avoid the thing that is about to happen, but perhaps in some way they do some important groundwork psychologically in preparing people for the trauma associated with the event when it does actually happen, that it kind of lays the ground in some way. And that seems to be how people understand them. So the car crash is in some ways inevitable. There's a purpose behind why this might happen in my future, but my dreams enable me to get the most out of that experience, to be prepared for it and not be discombobulated by it. And the next example I want to share with you is again an ongoing project that looks at after-death communications and again reflects a slightly different strategy. One of the great advantages of the focus group method is that Leslie Ann is part of that focus group facilitating and is able to revisit topics if they're maybe underexplored or if people say things which are kind of triggering that maybe suggest a whole new direction to take the conversation in, as reflected actually in the themes that I've just mentioned to you, that we have that comeback with people which allows us to flesh out the experiences a little bit more through that medium. The challenge, of course, is that it only works with very small groups. one-to-one interviews, small group focus groups are where that kind of facilitation can operate. With the after-death communications, we've tried to develop a halfway house where we can actually survey people, but document their experience in a much more thorough way. In some ways, we see this as being rather like a cognitive interview, the kind of interview you might use with eyewitnesses to a serious event, to make sure that we tap into all of their perceptions of that experience by interrogating their narrative from different directions. So I need to start by telling you a little bit about what an after-death communication is. In many ways, this is just an apparitional experience, so a ghostly kind of experience or an encounter experience. We've adopted the term after-death communications, which is quite a popular term in the literature. It has its origins in, I'm sure, ghost stories and some of the early haunting investigations that are documented by people like Alan Gould historically. We see them also as a key interest of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. So key publications in the early 20th century, the early 1900s, by those founders, Senses of Hallucinations and Phantasms of the Living, essentially involved collections of cases very much concerned with apparitional experiences. This has had a revival of interest in the 21st century, particularly among clinicians, and so we're kind of surfing that particular wave at the moment. So we define an ADC as an occurrence when a bereaved person unexpectedly perceives a deceased person in a manner that is interpreted as indicative of the continued survival of some aspect of that person. So our definition is ontologically neutral in the sense that we want to reflect the psychological reality of the experiencer. We're not really interested in testing that belief through this by insisting that they verify elements of their experience, because we're interested in the psychological reality for that person. We restrict ADCs in the following ways. So they must be spontaneous experiences. So contacts which are solicited in some way, initiated by, that are solicited through by the experience. For example, by using a Ouija board or by using some other kind of technology in order to create an encounter, they wouldn't be included in our data set. They are immediate or direct for the percipient. They're not mediated by another person, such as a mental medium. And they typically convey a message, which we call the 3 R's. So they're reassuring. Don't worry about me. The troubles I had at the end of life are now behind me. I'm much more happy now and contented. They're resolving. Any issues that we had between us when I died, if we didn't have a chance to make our peace before we died, don't worry about those. They're trivial, they're unimportant. All that really matters is fundamentally that we love each other, that we're deeply connected with one another. It doesn't matter about the money or the house or the property or whatever it is that we might have fallen out over in life. And they're reaffirming, they're establishing that loving bond that we had in life continues now that I'm past. So I am looking over you metaphorically. I am sending you positive energies. I am there supporting you in whatever ways that I can in the life decisions and the difficulties that you continue to face. Nevertheless, they're releasing as well. Don't kind of remain fixed in your grief. You need to break out of that, reorient yourself to the living and carry on with your own life. And in fact, in some cases, your connecting to me so deeply is actually holding me back from my spiritual journey that I need to go on. And so that reappraising, that kind of reorienting seems to be an important feature of some of the communications. So those are the kind of cases we were interested in, and we wanted to collect new cases using some kind of a survey method. We used an online survey using a platform called JISC Online Surveys, which allows us to construct intelligent surveys, which means that if we ask you a question to which you answer no, we don't then ask you 6 or 7 further questions about that particular topic. So for example, did your ADC have an auditory component? Did you hear the deceased? If you say no, it was only a visual experience, I didn't hear them say anything, we won't then ask you any questions that are related to auditory ADCs, that kind of idea. If people answer affirmatively to everything, our questionnaire comprises 194 questions. It probably takes about 2 hours to complete. would be my guess. And certainly many of our colleagues were very pessimistic about the possibility that anybody would devote the amount of time needed to complete the whole questionnaire, and that we were mostly wasting our time. We're an international, multinational group doing this research, so we created versions of the survey in English, Spanish, and French, and these were made available and advertised for a fixed period. I think it was about 6 or 7 months. Each of these was live. Importantly, the survey is constructed in a way that early on asks the person to describe their ADC in their own terms. So they're not coloured or shaped by any particular questions we might then go on to ask, which might signal to them, those are the bits that you think are important. Those are the bits you want me to talk about. We begin by saying, just in your own words, tell us about your experience. Responses to this varied from the quite disappointing, maybe a dozen or so words, through to pages and pages of material, perhaps 3,000 words in one or two of the cases. All told, across the collection of surveys, we have over 2 million words that have been volunteered as part of this first survey element. Following the spontaneous in your own words description, people were then asked more specific questions about features. Very often they'd begin with closed questions. Did you have a presence of the deceased without seeing or hearing them? Was it a kind of a sense of presence of the person? Yes, no, or I'm not sure. And if you answer yes to that, we'll ask you a little bit more. Well, did you have a sense of the geographical location of that presence? Could you locate it in space? Did you know who that person was? And if you answer yes to that question, in what ways were you able to identify who that person was if it was just a sensed presence? Those kind of things. We could get through this. So it allowed us to ask about various aspects of the experience, the different modalities that the experience might have. So some people have a visual experience, other people have a tactile experience. Some have experiences in dreams rather than while awake. And so we wanted to map all of those and see what they might tell us. After all of these 3 surveys had closed, we ended up with nearly 1,000 responses, complete responses from participants that were analyzable. You can see again, there's a predominance of female respondents over male respondents. This is partly a response bias, that women are more likely to volunteer cases than are men in situations like this. That's quite common in parapsychology. But even where you've got a captive audience, so where we do, for example, representative sample surveys using a market research company, we still find that although as many men respond to the survey as women, because of the way it's organized, men report fewer experiences, or at least, let's say, admit to those experiences. So there are still sex differences there. Otherwise, in terms of the demographics of our population here, they just present as ordinary people. I mean that in a very positive way. They're functional people. They have a range of occupations. They have different levels of education that's pretty typical for the population as a whole. They're in relationships. Some of them are divorced. Some of them are widowed. But again, the proportions of what we might expect from any sample of the general population. I wanted to focus just now, because of limited time, on just a couple of features of these experiences. And firstly, that's the modality of the experience. And so surprisingly for us, the most common medium for people to have an experience was in their dreams. And people were adamant that these were not common or garden variety dreams that were triggered by an especial need to be reconnected with their loved one that they'd lost. They were very clear that these were realer than real kinds of encounters or experiences, that something happened within them. Very often there might be a communication of information that was previously unknown, for example, or they spoke in a way that went beyond their normal understanding or appreciation of that person. And so they felt very confident, very secure that this was a communication, albeit through a dream modality. Beyond that, physical contacts were very common, then visual experiences, moving through to the other types. These are not mutually exclusive categories, as you might imagine. For example, people may have more than one ADC, and also if they have a single ADC, it can have more than one modality feature. You can have a visual experience where the person also speaks and you can hear them, a visual experience, and you also feel the sense of touch from that person. So these are not mutually exclusive. So there's quite a wide range of types of experience that people have. Here are some examples of those. I focused here on just some of the ones that are more evidential, just for parsimony, because we don't have that much time. So here are two from our collection. One's English and one's Spanish. E268 is the 268th respondent to the English survey. Again, all the details in these are anonymized. So where people mention names and things, they've been changed. So I awoke suddenly for no reason from a good sleep and saw my grandfather standing at the side of my bed. He seemed slightly younger, healthier, and radiating pure love. He smiled at me and said, "I'm going away, my wee dove," which was his pet name for me. I smiled back at him and looked at my alarm clock. It was 6 in the morning. Then he was gone. It didn't occur to me to ask my grandfather where he was going or why he was in my room at that time in the morning. I just slipped back into a peaceful sleep. But I was later awakened by the telephone ringing and my grandmother sobbing on the phone. Papa was dead. His death certificate later stated that the approximate time of death was 6 a.m. Similarly, one night I woke up and saw my biological father. He greeted me and said that he came to tell me that he was leaving and that he'd left me a small inheritance. He said that he'd met my children, that I had a beautiful family. He said goodbye with affection and left. I never had contact with him in life. I didn't meet him in person. I learned of his existence when I was 9 years old, when I found out that my father, with whom I grew up and whose surname I have, was not my biological father. However, I never sought, and nor did he, a reunion, and we didn't meet personally until after his death. 2 days after the experience, his family contacted me to notify me of his death and his desire that I receive an inheritance that he'd left me, which confirmed to me that my experience was real and accurate. I just wanted to touch again on the profundity of these experiences and how important they are. Sometimes we find that these experiences are marginalized because for most people, they're relatively rare. They're quite unusual in the normal weft and weave of anybody's life experience. They are punctuated only occasionally by these kinds of experiences. But when they do occur, they can be quite deeply meaningful for people and they can be transformative. So, for example, in our survey, overwhelmingly, people describe these experiences as being a deep source of comfort in helping them come to terms with their loss and their bereavement. Sometimes unsure is the case because the ADC concerns somebody that they didn't feel particularly emotionally close to in the first place. So those would be some of the exceptions there. And that there's a tension here because for many people, encountering their loved one again in this very vivid and real way for them actually drives home the pain once more that this person is no longer with them every day. And so it can be quite a painful experience to reminisce about once they've had their ADC. But nevertheless, although people accept or concede that pain, that they are still singularly glad that they had this experience. Also, there seems to be a rather interesting relationship with their sense of religiosity and spirituality. Again, if we look at how they felt before their ADC, there's quite a wide range of religiosity. Some people are quite strongly religious. Some people are not at all religious before their experience. And frankly, that doesn't change very much. So an ADC doesn't seem to impact too much on people's sense of religiosity. However, if we look at spirituality, more people just naturally feel that they do have some kind of a spiritual sense anyway before their ADC. And that is the feature that does seem to be reinforced by this experience. So it seemed, even though, for example, with near-death experiences, people can have NDEs that have religious iconography as part of them from a particular religious tradition. With ADCs, there doesn't seem to be that kind of a feature. It doesn't seem to reinforce those kind of traditional religious beliefs. So to reflect on this material thus far, ADCs, in our view, are really quite common, and they do seem to be unrelated to psychological need and are not indicative of pathology. They seem to be so commonplace during the bereavement process that it doesn't seem sensible to describe them as the DSM does, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, as being a kind of an adverse or a dysfunctional reaction to bereavement, because it's occurring to too many people for that to make much sense. They can vary very widely in form and content, but the impacts still seem to be the same. They seem to be universal. Fewer ADCs than expected occurred under conditions that are conducive to misperception. So very often they occurred when people were wide awake, under normal lighting conditions, either daylight or under electric light, rather than under the conditions where people have an ambiguous perception that may be prone to overinterpretation. If you're just waking up from sleep and the room is still half dark because it's only dawn or dusk, where you can misperceive a curtain or something, those don't seem to be able to account for very many of our quite large collection of cases. And in talking about this material, we're doing two things. Outreach focuses on speaking to ordinary people about ADCs to normalize those anomalous experiences, to explore how they occur to lots and lots of other people. And by sharing lots of examples, hopefully you'll find instances that resonate with some experiences of your own, and that can be a source of comfort. Equally, we seek to educate mental health professionals who may come into contact with people who have had ADCs and want to talk about them, but find that very uncomfortable because professionally they don't want to endorse delusional beliefs. They worry about this being indicative of pathology because they don't know the literature, they don't know the research, and they don't, frankly, know about the experiences themselves. Their knowledge in this area is pretty much the same as any layperson. So it's really important for us to reach out to those groups as well, to reassure them that actually ADCs are very different from experiences that are indicative of psychosis, for example. The features are very markedly different, and they should have no concern about allowing their patients or their clients a safe space to talk about these kinds of experiences. That leads us on, that's this idea of seeking therapy, for example, to a final point before we segue into the final part of the talk. And this is that although many people on reflection, thinking about their experience and personally can derive a great deal of comfort and meaning from their experiences, nevertheless, these spontaneous paranormal experiences can be a source of distress. And this takes a number of forms. Firstly, the experience itself is completely out of the blue. It's unexpected, it's surprising. The depiction of paranormal phenomena in the media has got a lot a lot of blame attributed to it for this, because very often these experiences are presented as being fearful or dangerous, when in fact, as hopefully we've even demonstrated in this short talk, very often they're very warm and loving and deeply connected experiences for people. But the very occurrence of them is out of the blue. It triggers those kinds of associations, and it may be quite anxiety provoking and distressing at the beginning of an experience. Secondly, on reflection, it's very difficult to come to terms with the implications of an experience. Existentially, what does this suggest? Many people are quite happy living a mundane existence, living in a material world where the things that preoccupy them are getting that promotion, getting the bigger house, going on holiday next summer, enhancing the relationship, looking after the children, all the things that are important to us in our everyday. And suddenly that's disoriented completely by an experience that says, well, all of these are set in a much broader context, a spiritual context in which you may be infinite, you may be immortal. Some aspect of your consciousness may be at one with all other consciousnesses. So these are very deep existential questions for people who've never thought about them previously. And again, if there are no resources out there for people to help them make sense of their experience and its implications, they can really struggle. They do fear that they'll be thought credulous or mad because that's the knee-jerk reaction of others as well. That's the way these experiences are portrayed. That is a typical reaction that we see from other people. Many of these spontaneous cases describe very often seems to be the husband, frankly, without being too sexist, who just dismisses this as nonsense, clearly a delusion, clearly a result of psychological need. Those are the kind of things that we're used to. In research where we look at people's experiences with therapists, we see a legacy from that, because that's the response or reaction of their community of people, their associates, their friends, and their neighbors. They're fearful to talk about these to therapists as well, because they expect to get the same reaction from them. Even where people allow them space to talk about them, they don't overtly say you're foolish or you're crazy. Nevertheless, there may be attempts to bracket your experience or to treat it as symbolic in ways that will devalue it. for you, this is a profoundly important thing, and even sharing it with someone else, there's a danger of it losing its luster. And the experience can feel isolating because there isn't this common sense that these are very commonplace experiences, quite rare, but they occur to very many people. It's quite a common experience as somebody in parapsychology to give a public talk. I think psychology departments is a good example. To give a talk to a psychology department and somebody to come up to me afterwards and say, don't tell this lot, but I've actually had a telepathic experience. And then they share their experience with you. And then somebody else from the audience, another psychologist, says, don't tell this lot because they're all really skeptical, but I've had an experience of that sort. I say, do you want to just talk to this guy who came to speak to me just before you? He had the same experience or a very similar one. And there is this real sense of being siloed, of being isolated from others and making assumptions about what other people will think about your experience. So we need to break out of those silos and not feel so isolated. And then, as we say, regular traditional medical and psychological services don't seem to take these experiences seriously enough, and they fail to address the existential questions that they might raise for people. So moving on to the final part of the talk, hopefully I've still got time for this. Do let me know if I am running out of time. I just want to talk about one other approach, which is really important to us at Northampton, and that's to engage with practitioners, with people for whom this is more an everyday occurrence, more part of their everyday life, part of their identity, who they are. And I want to talk especially about an association we have with the Spiritualist National Union based in the UK, which is a spiritualist organization of long standing. It's responsible for around about 240 spiritualist churches around the United Kingdom. And they provide mediums who service those different churches. There are 2 services a week on Wednesdays and Sundays, and typically there'll be a platform service with 3 mediums, 2 of whom give material evidence of survival, so they will attempt to communicate with your deceased relatives and give you messages, and 1 who might speak to spiritual philosophy or something similar. They're joyous occasions, very warm. They're quite secular in some ways. They're not related to any particular denomination. They're broadly Christian, but I don't think exclusively so. And they're a forum where people share communications. And the mediums who provide those messages, they're trained through the Arthur Findlay College, which is part of the SNU. So we have access to that community, and we're very interested in finding out about the lived experience of those mediums. And this is partly driven by that concern for mental health. So our starting point was, we have a group of people here who regularly have experiences which are otherwise pathologized. They see things other people can't see. They hear things that other people in the same space can't hear. They have embodied experiences that they don't identify as not self. You know, if they have stomachache or they have a chest pain, it's because this is the way this deceased person passed. This isn't me, this is other. If you disclose those kind of things to a GP, a general practitioner, or God forbid to a psychiatrist, there's a very real danger that you'll get a psychiatric diagnosis in volunteering those kinds of experiences. So we wanted to explore how these experiences are experienced by practitioners. Are they distressing? Are there mental health issues in coming to terms with those experiences? And I worked very closely with Liz Roxburgh for her PhD in doing some of this work. So I certainly want to give her most of the credit for this work. And involved an initial survey where we recruited spiritualists who were not mediums. So people who share the same belief system but don't claim to have those kinds of experiences, and also spiritualist mediums. So they have these beliefs, but also have regularly those kinds of experiences. And we asked them a little bit about themselves, but we also gave them a number of measures that asked about well-being. And we discovered, surprisingly perhaps, that mediums actually present as more psychologically well than do other spiritualists. And they present with less psychological distress than other spiritualists. And they present as more psychologically well than the general public when we look at norms for the population as a whole. So there's something really interesting going on. What is it about these mediums that puts them in that position? So we had to follow up, and we conducted interviews with some mediums to find out about their lived experience. And we found that there was quite a common pathway. So we found, for example, that very often they had spontaneous experiences in childhood. And these were just a common feature of the growing up experience from the cot in some cases, for others when they were first becoming verbal, so from age of maybe 3 or 4, and for others maybe a little bit later. And very much commonly, there was this sense that this is something that everybody has. You know, I'm no different from everybody else. And it was quite a surprise then to discover that other people didn't have the same experiences that they were having. And in particular, there seems to be a fork in the road, and they would take one of two directions. In one direction, if they disclose these experiences to loved ones, so family members, for example, or to friends, and they received a positive response. So very typically, they might find that their mother or their grandmother was also mediumistic, and they were regarded as sensitive, that this was just a normal, healthy part of growing up, and not to think too much about it. And these were treated as psychologically real phenomena. People found it quite easy to accommodate to them, to interact with the experiences that they were having, and to learn ways to manage those experiences. For others, and the person I have in mind here really is Eileen Garrett, the famous medium who founded the Parapsychology Foundation. She was brought up as an Irish Catholic, and she was brought up by her aunt, who was very devout, and saw these experiences as the work of the devil. And Eileen was regularly beaten when she talked about some of her early childhood experiences, and learned very quickly not to share these experiences with people, certainly not outside of the home, because this would be a source of shame and embarrassment. Some of our mediums had that kind of experience in their childhood, and spent many years wrestling to manage or suppress these experiences, but rather trying to squeeze a balloon. If you squeeze in one place, it just bulges out in another place instead. And that was quite a common experience. And that's illustrated with, apologies, what is quite a long quote, but I think it captures so many features of a number of our mediums' experience. I'd like to share it with you in a bit of detail. So that's here. And this medium, Sarah, and again, pseudonyms are used here. She says, the first memory that I actually have was hearing voices after my father died. One night I went to bed and I woke up and I'd had these voices talking to me, saying that my dad was fine. He was living. There wasn't a problem. He wouldn't want me to be so upset. And I thought I was dreaming. So I thought, well, pull yourself together. And as I turned over to go back to sleep, the voices were still there. So I thought, I'm losing it. I'll go down and I'll make a cup of tea. Of course, that's what we do in England. If there's anything that's problematic, we just make a cup of tea, and that solves lots of things. So I went down, and all the while I was making this cup of tea, these voices were still talking to me. So I went to the doctors and I told him what had happened. And I said, I must be having a nervous breakdown, again, because she didn't have that cultural reference to understand it in any other terms. So the doctor gave me some pills, as they do, told me to go away for a few days and just try and chill and relax. But I never took the pills because I don't take tablets. I don't believe in that sort of thing. I thought, right, this is me, and now I need to cure myself to get better. So I just pulled myself together, blocked absolutely everything out, that I've really just got back on track. And I did that probably for about 6 or 7 years. But then I started to talk to a medium friend, and we just sat chatting about things. And that's when my interest started, because they were explaining things to me. That was the first real knowledge that somebody was talking to me, i.e. the voices. Steph and her sister were starting to explain all these things to me, and all the little things that had happened over the years, which you just put down as, oh, that must be that, and that must be that. It was all starting to make sense. And I think that's fairly typical, quite refreshing. People discovered mediumship and suddenly found their real home. That's a very common metaphor when we speak to mediums who visit the Arthur Findlay College from all around the world. There's a sense of coming home to that community. That like-minded people, shared experiences, a sense of appreciation and respect, and of acceptance. So that brings us to the end. What then, based on this, is the value of real-world cases? Well, we started off with the idea that they can help identify necessary or sufficient conditions, situational and personal, for psi to occur, so that we can do a better job of designing experiments that are ecologically valid. Even in the cases that we've shared this evening, things like altered states of consciousness, any way in which we might distract or dislocate the ego self, they seem to be very positive. elements to that kind of experience, for example. Sensitive emotional connection to the people we want to communicate with, that seems to be a key feature of many of these situations. The phenomena themselves relate to the profound crisis situations all the way through to the trivial, finding a lost object. So there's a lot of variety there. But possibly more important than that is that case collections of these sorts have value in and of themselves. They allow us to represent those people who otherwise don't have a voice in academia. They reassure people who hear talks like this that their spontaneous experiences needn't necessarily trouble them, at least not for the distressing reasons that I listed earlier. They can emphasize that these experiences are not odd, uncommon, or unimportant. And we can recognize that even if they are rare or unexpected in most people's lives, where we're not especially sensitive, they can have a profound impact on us. They can express something fundamental about what it is to be a living, conscious being. And then finally, we can use this kind of material to help educate mental health professionals about the benefits of taking such experiences seriously. I hope some of that was of interest to you. Thank you for your attention. I'm really happy to take some questions.
Okay, first of all, we'd like to thank Chris Rowe for his really fascinating talk. It is midnight in the UK, so we don't want to keep Chris up too long, but I think we've got time for a few questions. People in the Zoom, if you want to put any questions into the chat, and we'll monitor those. So does anybody have a question in this room? Yes, Nikki. Would you like to shout your question out? The mics are supposed to pick up that, so let's see if they work.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. That was really fascinating material, both the statistics and the accounts. So my question is, I would love to hear your thoughts on the implications of your work on the nature of consciousness. Obviously, at this point, many different theories and models have been put forth. Love to know your favorites, and then you know, whether you think that consciousness is brain-based or it may be a more fundamental ontological aspect of the cosmos.
That's a really interesting question and very challenging. And immediately I kind of have a get out of jail card, which is I don't profess to be a philosopher or a neuroscientist. So I don't think my opinion needs to carry a great deal of weight from those perspectives. I am intrigued, though, by the idea that we know very little about the nature of consciousness, despite all the concerted efforts that have been made to interrogate it. I think clearly there are correlations between neurological activity and people's phenomenal experience, but I don't think we're any closer to understanding whether that's a causal relationship or whether in some way the brain is acting as a mediator of conscious experience. I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that consciousness is fundamentally immaterial, is situated outside of space-time, but the way in which it can interact with space-time is through the brain and through this particular embodied form. So that would be my sense, that that isn't particularly founded on the evidence per se. I think at the moment, my focus is not really so much on the scientific learnings as it is on being of some kind of social benefits to the general public. You know, so the kind of evidence that I'm trying to amass isn't so much conceptual as it is intended to enable people to accept their experiences and to feel that they have license to reflect on them, to attempt to integrate them and derive meaning from them for themselves.
Thank you so much.
We have a question at the front from Joe.
As we learn and document more reflections on death and after-death scenarios, I have a thought that it may foster a general increase of suicides as a way of escaping the trauma of the day, knowing from all this documentation that, my gosh, I can just pass this up as we are and skip it. So that's just been percolating in my mind for the last few years. as a danger point in people learning more about this. Any comment?
I think that seems like a reasonable expectation, which isn't supported by the data, maybe somewhat surprisingly. If we take the case of near-death experiences, we find that people who have come near death, for example, by suicide, actually are much less inclined to attempt suicide again. Many people have an experience which is so sublime that in many ways, it's such a wrench for them to come back to this mundane world from the glimpse that they've had of that experience. You would think that they are motivated to want to return as quickly as possible. But again, in fact, the opposite seems to be the case. They seem to feel settled with the notion that that day will come, that they can have patience, that in some ways that glimpse is enough to satisfy them for now, that thirst. So there seems to be an opposite kind of experience there. Certainly among the ADC phenomena, so the cases we have where the ADC encounter is with somebody who has taken their own life. Again, there does seem to be a moralistic strand to that. It's very difficult to know whether that is something which is projected onto the experience, but very often such ADC entities report that they were not themselves at the point when they took their own lives, that things were rather chaotic for them psychologically or spiritually, and that they are in a much better place now. They're much more contented, but that, you know, if they could have their time again, they wouldn't have attempted suicide. So there seem to be messages that come from that, of those sorts, I think, which maybe would argue against, you know, us all kind of lemming-like heading for the cliffs.
Thank you.
Dr. Rowe, we have a question in the chat that I'm going to read to you from Nan. She says, I am wondering if you have procedures to help experiencers be more specific and or leave off the idea that they should be censoring things they think are not interesting. Some protocol for making the space open to whatever information or detail comes to their minds as they talk about their experiences.
Absolutely. So that, I think, is a frustration, but also a great strength of some of these approaches, because on the last slide, I talked about the need to give people a voice to represent people. And that necessarily means you have to speak to the things that they regard as important, not just the things that you think might be important, given, you know, your book reading and so on, and talking to other academics. So it's really important to represent people in their own terms so that what you provide is authentic. At the same time, some of those omissions are just because of maybe a misunderstanding about what people think you want to hear, or what bits you will regard as important. And so some of the techniques that we talked about here are more successful than others. So an interview or focus group methodology allows for you to come back to people, say, oh, well, it was really interesting before, you just mentioned such and such a thing in passing. Can we just go back to that and say a little bit more about that? That was really fascinating. So there are lots of positive ways in which we can encourage people to open up on things they think are quite trivial. Mechanically, something like this enormous survey that we have tries to do the same job without our being there, because it can monitor the things that you've said yes or no to. It can follow up and say, oh, well, that's interesting. You said that your visual experience ended quite suddenly. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? So did it end suddenly in sense of it kind of evaporating, or did you turn away and when you turned back, the person suddenly had disappeared and it was too short a time for them to walk out the room? Those kind of things we can build into that, but always it relies on the ingenuity of the designer of the survey. And I think organically, as a psychologist, the better approach is to be a human being in relation with another human being as they tell you their story.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Chris, one more question in the chat. Do you have any comments on Gary Schwartz's ADC project with Soul Phone?
I don't know a great deal about it. There are certainly occasions when people receive experiences with technology, and it seems to reflect the time in which we live. A colleague of mine at Northampton, Cal Cooper, has a book of some years now called Telephone Calls from the Dead. And that brings together a number of such cases from the modern era. I think they're more challenging to explain, but of course, I think when people have an experience, there's no requirement for any of it to have an objective reality, and that doesn't necessarily undermine its status as a real thing. So to explain what I mean by that, very famously, the SPR founders entitled one of their books, Hallucinations, Senses of Hallucinations. And the experiences that they document in that very often involve apparitions. And their understanding of those experiences was that when people have an apparitional experience, in some way that is a creation of the person's psyche, perhaps their brain, rather than necessarily being an objective experience. So although it might cast shadows, it casts shadows in the sense that the person perceives shadows, not that, for example, it would be picked up by a video camera or by a photograph. So I think my sense is that these experiences are hallucinatory, probably in that sense. There is a trigger to the experience, which is ontologically real, but the way that it's experienced is created. In these telephone situations, I would be quite surprised if we find that the telephone exchange has a record of those phone calls from the dead. I very much suspect that it is a hallucinatory type of experience.
Do we have any other questions in the room, or can I sneak my question in? Oh, okay, it's a naughty question. So really, how has your understanding of psi phenomena evolved over your career, and what is your current understanding of psi? Big question again, Mike Nickies.
I think it reflects, in a way, I guess what came out of the talk as well is my understanding of psychology, I think, has become much richer and more nuanced. I think it's really important not to treat participants as data generators who only have one variable, whichever thing you happen to be interested in that particular experiment. They're rich and rounded sentient beings who are in interaction with you always. And I think psi is part of that. I'm really excited by Jim Carpenter's first sight theory, because it suggests that psi is ubiquitous. It feeds into all aspects of what it is to be a human being and how we interact with other people, how we interact with our environment, how we're able to survive and flourish. All of those things kind of work together, and you can't simply extricate psi from that process. Now, inevitably, as a result of that, it means that psi is going to be incredibly complicated. So, you know, I'm not especially frustrated that psi in experiments sometimes seems like it's very subtle, maybe weak sometimes, inconsistent, even capricious. I think those are exactly the qualities we should expect if psi is something which is rich, complex, nuanced, and sensitive to lots and lots of different factors in an environment. You know, there are lots of other situations where we take that for granted. If somebody comes for a job interview, the slightest thing can upset them, you know, and they're off their stride for the whole of that interview and things go terribly. Somebody giving an audition on the stage, somebody performing in a sports event, you know, the slightest things can ruin everything. You're suddenly, you know, not at all who you normally are. That doesn't make any of those things less real. The fact that they are susceptible to so many kind of factors, and that we can't tell, you know, nobody hits a baseball every time they face one. That kind of thing.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, do we have time for one more question? Yes.
My question is this: just as we have many horror movies that reflect the paranormal activity or the paranormal movement of things being moved without a body being seen, is it because stuff like that is real in real life, or it's just for a fairy tale?
Did you hear that, Chris?
Yeah, I did. Yes. That is a perfect question for a Bill Roll lecture, because, you know, the kind of phenomena that he documented very meticulously absolutely suggests that those things are possible. And it suggests that they are possible under certain special circumstances that seem to involve some kind of a deep frustration that can't be expressed, some heightened emotion that's very difficult to channel. So there seem to be circumstances in which we get those elements or features. The impressive demonstrations of macro PK in the laboratory, people like Felicia Perez, Nina Kalagina, for them, absolutely, it was a physically draining, emotionally draining process. So there seems to be something about those features which are necessary for those kinds of phenomena to occur. They, frankly, seem to be a world away from somebody who can, bend spoons in Israel. Those kind of things don't seem to really reflect the same kind of phenomenon. Spoon bending parties, the kind of Jack Hook kind of thing, there are other qualities there that seem to be important. Pamela Ray Heath describes this in a lot of detail, and it reflects what we've talked about today again. So there seems to be really important that people become so immersed or absorbed in their activity that they lose their sense of self. They become in some way at one with the system that they're part of. There seems to be a sense of timelessness about it. So things do seem to, there is an upsurging of energy that people sometimes sense. So there are a number of features there that I think we've had hints and glimmers of, but that maybe we haven't operationalized terribly well.
One more. This is
One
the
more.
last question. Sorry.
That was a really wonderful lecture. I'm wondering, how do you see the role of parapsychology? We're talking about the reality, are these things real or not? And obviously there's people have different ideas of what that means. But if we're speaking broadly, the fields of parapsychology and religion have really been the realms where these two, or the fields where these two fields have been where this has been discussed, at least academically. And I'm just going to take it there with the US, starting to talk about non-biological trash retrievals and things. How do you see the role of parapsychology and parapsychologists as perhaps the general public becomes more comfortable with these ideas?
That kind of links to a question I had at a recent conference where people were asking, as people become more exposed to the idea, for example, of life after death, is that not going to profoundly change how people interact one with another? Well, up until recent times, the kind of the late Enlightenment, the vast majority of people on the planet believed that these phenomena were real. I think, if we move away from kind of weird societies, so white and educated intellectual societies, the vast majority of people accept psi phenomena as a real phenomenon. So I don't necessarily see there being any kind of societal transformation necessarily. In a way, I don't know if it's relevant, but your question reminded me of the preface to a skeptic's book by Jim Alcock. And he said, well, what kind of world would it be if psi were a real phenomenon? Suddenly, dictators and despots would never be able to be overthrown because they could have psychics to work out who was plotting against them. All sorts of things would suddenly be dysfunctional and undermined. Well, the kind of world you would get if psi were real is this one. If psi is real, this is what you get. Psi of the quality and the consistency that we currently have. Nothing will change just because people come to recognize that feature of reality. It will remain the same. Maybe more people might spend more time trying to cultivate psychic abilities, but some of the great Eastern traditions have been doing that for thousands of years, and we haven't necessarily seen a sea change in society as a result of it either. So I guess in that sense, I'm kind of pessimistic that we'll see any great change as these ideas become more established. In terms of the objective reality of psi phenomena, I think it's really important to note that actually the kind of effect sizes we see in our lab-based formal experiments for psi phenomena are about the same order of magnitude we see for other psychological phenomena. Because all those other phenomena also involve whole human beings who have their own thoughts and expectations about the situations we put them in. So our phenomena in parapsychology are about as real as any other phenomena that psychologists lay claim to.
Great answer, Chris. This is a good point to stop, perhaps.
I think so, yeah, let's give Chris a round of applause.
Let's go to bed now. If you've been interested.
Good night, all.
There's actually SPR conference this weekend and Chris is speaking at that, I believe. It's online, so you can zoom in from the US if you're interested in that. We can give you details of that. But yeah, thank you very much for coming tonight and thank you, Chris, for staying up late for us.
Good night, all. Enjoy your day.
Bye.
Bye.